This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. I've got a really unique guest today, Lucia Dore from New Zealand, and she's a financial journalist. She's an editor, author, and documentary maker. And today is all about creative side and the skills needed to be a good communicator, both in written, both in film form. We're going to talk all things, Israel-Gaza war, female entrepreneurship. Nothing's going to be AI, nothing's going to be left off the table. So I'm really happy to welcome Lucia to the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Christopher.
Yeah, kind of set the ground stage of your background, your journey, and I'm really excited to dive into your way of thinking, your mindset, how you view the world.
Well, I'm from Southland, New Zealand, which is at the very bottom of the world, if you like. The next stop is Stewart Island, Antarctica. So I went from there, and I was very focused on economics and politics. So I went first to the New Zealand Treasury, where I was an economist, and I used to forecast inflation and things like that. When I was there, I was born in a place called Lumsden, which is the year before Bill English, who was New Zealand Prime Minister, so it must be an okay place. And then after that, I went to journalism school. I won a scholarship. I went to the UK, and I was there for 18 and a half years. And I was editing a lot of financial magazines, and I did technology and finance. And then I, for my sins, went to the Middle East. And I was a journalist there. I was head of a newswire service, which focused really on M&A, which was part of the Financial Times group for 8.5 years. And I spent there. Now, what is interesting, although I say M&A, is all about families and who you know and what they do and connections and all the rest of it. And I had, well, not always a straightforward time in the Middle East for a whole lot of reasons. And then from there, I went back to New Zealand, and I made a documentary. In my first year, I was a master's course I was doing at Canterbury, and I made a documentary on refugees, which is now coming true. It was before refugees were really a fashion. They became a fashion about 2 years later. And it was New Zealand's response to the refugee crisis, which really hasn't changed a lot. And under the current government, it won't at all. And then when I was in Queenstown for a while, and then I've moved to Dunedin. I moved up to Dunedin, and I've bought a place up here. It's more, and I wrote a book last year, Seniority, the relationship with AI and technology. And I'm, in fact, writing another book about my story and my journey. But I don't think it's particularly easy for a female. I think, there are lots of things, but that's really, in a nutshell, where I am now. So I've been all over, and I was in Vietnam and teaching English in 2019. So I have an online business English course as well, which came out of that too.
Yeah, so I love that. First we'll dive into kind of your career, and kind of sounds like you're a very successful journalist, and it sounds like the underlying theme of being a good journalist is kind of getting a good story and then communicating. So one question is, what are the best ways to communicate and key attributes you need to be a good communicator, both in your career and your personal life?
Well, I think being a good communicator is listening. I think it's more about listening than talking. You have to communicate what you think, but you have to listen to what the person says and responds. And I think almost the art of listening is disappearing as people get caught up in social media. So you don't listen as much, and you see that even on television. The journalists tend not to listen to the answers. They just have prepared questions that they want to answer. And that is a problem. I also, in the UK, in fact, I helped set up a communication company, which really focus on presentation skills, and, communicating your message. And I really think it's about listening, and it's being able to be powerful in what you have to believe in something and be powerful in communicating that. They're the two things I would say. And as a journalist, yes, you have to have a good story and you have to communicate it, but you have to communicate it well. It has to be readable. So shorter sentences are better than longer ones. Don't use complicated words if you don't have to. Don't make it more complicated than you need to. And often people do want to make it complicated because it makes them feel as though they know a lot more. Well, that's not the way life is, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
You have to listen.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. It's kind of counterintuitive because you think, to be a good communicator, you have to be eloquent and gregarious and extroverted and, everybody's listening to you. But it's quite interesting that you said that to be a good listener.
Yeah, I think you have to be all of the things that you said when you're communicating, but you do have to listen because the other people want to say something too, and you respond to what they say. That's the way it is. And I suppose I learned that particularly because in the Middle East, you have to listen to what people say, men principally. And you respond to that, and then they have their ideas of you. So you just continue to let them think that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So we'll kind of break it down because you have these two key themes in your which I find fascinating. And the first is senior citizens and technological adaptation. And in your book, Seniority, I'm not sure if but
Seniority, yeah.
oh yeah, seniority. And you talk about how AI and tech can enhance senior living. And what key insights did you discover about relationship between seniors, emerging technologies, AI, and how these insights improve tech design?
Well, I think that we found out that certainly people may not like technology because they don't know it, because they think that they're bad at it. But in fact, lots of people are bad at it. Younger people, it's hard to keep up with changes, and therefore they feel uncomfortable. And if they want to be taught, they prefer being taught by their relations, but that isn't necessarily the most effective. So they need to know that they use technology and AI every day, particularly in the kitchen, whether it's heating or ovens or something. So it's not necessarily computers. And with healthcare, I mean, it's come such a long way. Something can be wrong, but the system can pick it all up much better now as a result of using AI.
Oh,
And I think somebody said to me that they noticed that over the last few years, the older people are becoming more accepting of technology and AI because it's being used for more social good, like climate change. And I thought that was quite interesting. That was the one thing. And then we noticed how much it was used. It's used for wealth, for accumulation of wealth, although that we also discovered there's a lot of discrimination with ageism. They talk about ageism as being young, but ageism can be old too.
yeah.
So I think all that is hugely different, and that's what's changed. Yeah, so I'm trying to think what other things there were. There was health, wealth. Really, that's sort of then the key find. We also found that people didn't embrace technology, and they, just because they have an aversion to it, which was quite bizarre. I use the example of my mother, who was 80, and she wouldn't use internet banking at all. And she would have to go into the bank and, oh, what a hassle. And yet my father, who was 87, embraced it and did everything online. So there isn't necessarily, and yet I have a case study from a 92-year-old who won't touch technology. And that is because she thinks it's bad. I think they have to be convinced that you can't there isn't more fraud created because of technology. In fact, probably less fraud and things like that. But I think there's just a lot more teaching and a lot more convincing that they have to go in for some people. That's what we learned. There was such a contrast.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I haven't walked into a bank, for almost more than 20 years now. And just the thought of it just is just very foreign, it's like kind of like just where you can do everything away and but like for example, my parents, they just recently canceled their landline. So they've had a landline for I haven't had a landline since like 2002. So
Exactly.
kind of moving on is this idea of because you've this whole thing with the Middle East with Israel and Gaza and or Israel and Palestine, and then you've and as an entrepreneur launching media company focused on disruptive technology and Middle Eastern politics, what are the most significant lessons?
Well, what was interesting for me is that, okay, I was in the Middle East and I'd been to Israel and Palestine, and I was as I say, I was head of a newswire service. So what I found interesting is I wrote my story and stuff that happened to me with guns and the rest of it. And it was from the Israeli side, not the Palestinian. And I was locked in. It was when the Turkish flotilla had been caught and not on the Mediterranean. So the Israelis were on high alert, and I was being shut into the wall, the walls that come down. And I think, oh, and I asked the way out, and they just pointed a gun at me. And I thought, oh, I can't deal with this. I really couldn't deal with that. And what happened is that because I had been in Israel and Palestine, but I had to be very careful going in. I had gone in with a group of Palestinians as well, that my passport wasn't marked, because at that stage there was no communication with the Arab countries, with Israel. I couldn't even telephone, it just wouldn't answer because there was no connection, because the Arab countries didn't recognize Israel.
Yeah.
And so I found it quite interesting from that. And then when I posted on Facebook and LinkedIn, I had various people saying that it was edited because it wasn't the narrative that they wanted, but it was my experience and it was what happened to me. So it's interesting that even that proved unpalatable in some regions. Of course, I was living in Arab countries, and I had to, I had to conform to what was required. But it's interesting that in those countries, the Westerners are generally paid more, but they give women more status if they wear an abaya and hijab, and the rest of it is, quite contrary to what you think. So you just, I had I think it was hugely informative, and it was hugely informative the week that I spent in East Bethlehem, going into Jerusalem at a time when the country was on high alert. So I hate to think what is now. It's also been interesting because when I came back to New Zealand, I did interview the director of health of UNRWA, who is a Palestinian refugees, and I'll put that up. And I've been trying to speak to him again. And the day that I'd organized to speak with him recently, he had to fly to Egypt, to Rafah crossing, all the rest of it. And about 100 people from the UN have now been killed doing that. And I keep thinking, I don't hear from him. I'm thinking, oh, he's dead. He came back to me the other day and said, oh, it's just dire, and I'm so sorry, it's been so long. But he can't do anything. He's just working all the time to try and sort this situation out with the Palestinian refugees, which is why he was involved in the first. He's Japanese. So I think that I just learned a lot, and I was more aware of the history. What shocks me is that people don't know what the history is behind these countries, happening, and they almost, I think a lot of people think the history has started from October the 7th. It hasn't. It's gone on for centuries,
Yeah.
decades and centuries, and Britain and France have a lot to do with it as well. The tactics that the Palestinians are using are other tactics that the British used when they created Israel in 48. So, they were creating Israel in the 30s. But, the tactics come back to the West. And I think that's what you appreciate lots of things that don't happen. I think I learned a great deal there about how you have to react to different cultures, and you don't often realize that you have to do so much for other cultures. Like in New Zealand, a good example is in New Zealand, people tattoo. People believe, in Polynesia, everybody gets tattoos, and in New Zealand, everybody's got tattoos, and they think it's all fine. But it's not fine in places like Japan or the Middle East. I think people have to be conscious of what is acceptable and what is not. And that's what I say. And, and as somebody, I'm writing about all that now. In fact, I am writing another book, and that is obviously part of it. I mean, censorship definitely comes into it, particularly in that part of the world. But then censorship is happening all over the world now.
Yeah.
What you can and cannot write, what's woke, what's not, And who's to say, is it an individual should make up their mind, or should governments? But in those places, you get used to censorship and you get told what you can and cannot write. And I was tapped many times on the phone. I had a landline. And my father, they would ring on the landline and he would say something like Iran, and then the phone would go down. So it would happen.
Yeah.
And it happens everywhere now.
Really fascinating discussion. So kind of close it out, advice for female entrepreneurs, and kind of inspiring, and how can people follow you, contact you, etc.
Well, I'm working on a project now. It's an information technology project. And I think that female entrepreneurs just have to keep going. I think no matter what anybody says, it's harder for females just because people expect, and that's really what it comes down to. You have to just keep fighting, and you have to believe in what you're doing, and eventually it becomes
Yeah.
people believe in you. You have to believe in yourself first, and you have to keep fighting.
How can people contact you?
Oh, they contact me. Probably a personal email is probably easier, given that I am in New Zealand and there's a big time difference. lucia.claire.dore@gmail.com. Or you can go to my websites, and I have a media company, lcdmedia.net, and you can contact me there, or you'll get other emails from different, at my personal website, .co.nz. They'll have all the emails there. But I think that's easier because of, as I say, the time difference. We are the first country in the world to get the day.
All right. Well, thanks for a very fantastic, intriguing conversation, and thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you.